Hey, first period. I'm so sorry for what happened today. I restarted and restarted my computer, and only now at it's almost 10 o'clock have I is Zoom finally working for me, and everything seems to be back on track, and hopefully will work so more smoothly for my remaining classes today. So, in the meantime, let's kind of pick up where some things that I started with class earlier, and that is reminder: there's no asynchronous assignment that you need to be working on. Yay! Also, with the exception, right, of that you can be working on paper 4, which isn't due until a Tuesday, which is a little bit different deadline, January 12th. So it's not even when we come back from break, it's the following week. But I would suggest that you start thinking about it. It is going to require some research on your part. And that's why I'm giving you kind of a little bit longer time frame. Today during class, I shared a link with you. I will reshare that link with you as well in an email that I send the video link for this recorded lecture to with. Just to show you which people have been taken so far. We can't have any duplicates, but you can see the ones that are available. I've listed everybody's names. That way you could go back and take a look at and double check, make sure you got the person that you wanted to. So you have that link already, but I'll send it to you again just so you can see it one more time. So paper 4, and that is a 2-part assignment in that you need to write the speech and have the citations and everything in the submitted paper version that you're going to upload to Canvas. And you also need to do a recording using Flipgrid, and the link for that is posted in the assignment on Canvas for you as well. If you have any questions about paper 4, you're welcome to email me. And of course, we'll talk about this when we come back after winter break. So in the meantime today, it's all about the Civil War. We're not going to be doing any lecture reading on Chapter 13 because, well, we're out of time that I can really assign homework on people for people and still get the paper and studying for the exam because of the limitations placed on by FCPS about amount of time you can spend doing homework. So that's why you only have the paper and the final between now and the end of this semester. So let me kind of front load. We're going to take a lot of notes today. I hope you pay attention to this. There's a lot of details, things that are in the PowerPoint and or whatever it is, Google Slides, and things that I'm going to say here as well. And if we were doing this via Zoom, there would have been a couple of poll questions that would have popped up for you, but I'll just kind of tell you what those are and ask you to reflect about those too. So the PDF for these slides is already posted on Canvas as always, and I'll put this recording there as well for you. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Civil War. This war that begins in 1861 and ends in 1865. 4 long years of bloody, disastrous fighting within this country. We know, based on what we read in Chapter 13, that we see that it all really starts with the election of Lincoln, which is in 1860. Of course, he doesn't take office until March. That's when inauguration was in 1861. But Lincoln's election really triggers it. Why is that? Because Lincoln was a Republican. We know that the Republican Party, however, is not an anti-slavery party. That's really important for you to understand. The Republican Party's platform was against the expansion of slavery, the further spread. But Southerners saw that as, well, then you might as well be against slavery. If you're going to prevent the spread of slavery, that they saw that as no different than being anti-slavery, because they were relying on the further spread of slavery in order to continue to go cotton in new areas as the existing land was becoming less arable because of the damage done by the constant cotton harvesting. So they were relying on the ability to spread slavery to continue to continue the cotton economy. So when Lincoln's elected in November of 1860, and then the Electoral College happens in December of 1860. The very first state to secede is South Carolina. South Carolina that has been almost like begging or tempting to secede for so long, going back to John C. Calhoun's exposition and protest during the nullification crisis that happened. Lincoln, so they're the first, and then other states follow. And we'll take a look at a map that shows this kind of how secession played out. But this idea that Lincoln, however, insists that he's not just going to let secession happen. Some people have said, well, okay, did secession have to mean war, right? why couldn't we just let the South go and let them do their thing, or let them fail because they would have? But why did it have to be war? Well, Lincoln had a strong ideological belief that this was a union that could not be torn apart. That wasn't like opt in, opt out kind of a thing, temporary, but it was a permanent, inviolable union of states to make one country. So let's take a look at a map of secession, and I'll give you a second to look at it. So if we were doing this on Zoom, as fifth period is going to, God willing, yeah, a poll question would pop up just to kind of test your understanding of what's happening here. And it would have been a true false poll question that said, true or false, the states with the largest enslaved population and which relied the most on slavery were the first to secede. True or false? The states with the largest enslaved population and which relied the most on slavery were the first to secede. Hopefully you would have come up with that is a true statement, because it is those areas that we think about as being the lower or the deep South states that are the first to secede. And I'll go ahead and put my line up here. We talked about that dividing line previously between the upper South and the deep South being right along the Carolina border here. So that North Carolina going across is typically considered part of the upper South. There was still more cotton, or excuse me, more tobacco and less cotton. And down here we see the deep South, which is much more reliant on the cotton economy and therefore has the largest population of enslaved people. And the internal slave trade is playing into that, right? As enslaved people are being sold, quote, downriver, increasingly in that downward pattern. Now, as we look at the rest of this map here, we can see the red states at the top, Union states. But then there are these, like, what color is that? Teal blue, something like that. These sort of turquoisey teal blue states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. These 4 states. And notice on the map, they're labeled as border states that did not secede. That means that they are part of the Union. And this is a key vocab term that you'll need to understand for your final. A border state is a state that had slavery, but did not secede and stayed in the Union. So that when we look at this map, we know that the quote North, the Union, over whom Abraham Lincoln is the president and remains president throughout the war, are all the states in red, and also those 4 states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri as well, and how vital they were to the North's success. The location of this, because if you look at where our capital is, Washington, D.C., if Maryland had seceded, our capital of the Union of the United States would have been surrounded by the Confederacy. That wouldn't have been good at all. So it was really important that, for many reasons, because it provided that buffer from the South, because it provided needed resources, needed agricultural resources, and additional troops as well, potential troops to draft later in fighting this war as well. And it kept those resources, those people, that food that's grown in Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, from the South as well, from the Confederacy. So the first states to secede are the states in the darkest blue in the deep South. And then comes the states in gray, where we see the states that seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter. So let's talk about that fall of Fort Sumter. That happens in April of 1861 here, and it is considered kind of the opening shot, the opening confrontation. It is in Charleston, South Carolina. And to give you a little background that was mentioned a little bit more from the reading, Fort Sumter is a U.S. military fort. It was built in the harbor outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Maybe you've been there, seen it. It's really kind of nice. And it was done to protect the city of Charleston from invaders, pirates, whatever they might be, because of how valuable Charleston was as a harbor in the South, because that's where so much of that indigo and other crops rice were leaving and things were entering by the port city of Charleston. So it's built and established by the U.S. military in order to protect Charleston. But now that South Carolina has seceded, we have this U.S. military fort. Literally, you can see it. Even I can see it without my glasses. If you're in the city of Charleston and looking out across the water, it's there. And because it's designed to guard it. Well, it has gradually been de-staffed. There's less and less people there, and there is a minimal kind of skeletal assembly of soldiers that are assigned to Fort Sumter. But they're running out of provisions because they can't get things in from the north. Lincoln orders and says, you know what? I'm going to order, sends this ship down, the Star of the West, to resupply the Fort Sumter. And in order to prevent the resupply of food and weapons, right, and munitions, instead, South Carolina, Charleston, fires upon from the battery. If you've been to South Carolina and been to Charleston, you've seen the battery where there's all these cannons still lined up, pointing out and still kind of directed at Fort Sumter there to protect right the city. Fires upon it, and that is kind of the opening shots of the Civil War. Now, when this happens and conflict, if you will, ensues, like there's actual like an attack, that's when the Upper South decides to secede. They're like, oh, well, we're going now. Virginia, our state, secedes, and Lincoln then issues a call up for federal troops. He says, we need to organize. Now, this isn't a draft yet, right? But instead, he issues and demands for a calling up. Okay, guys, let's get organized. Let's call up our militia. Not a draft. They are going to do that later in the war. But at this point, it's people volunteering. Now, here's a thesis statement, if you will, that I think we should look at kind of closely here for its many parts. We see this idea that although Confederate leadership showed initiative and daring during the war, the Union ultimately succeeded for these reasons. And we're going to kind of go through each of these reasons here today. Due to improved military leadership, more effective strategies, key victories, greater resources and more stuff, and the wartime destruction of the South's environment and infrastructure. So although the Confederacy starts out with a couple of real advantages as far as the initiative and daring early in the war, the Union's success is going to come about for those reasons. So let's take a look at those. First of all, let's look at what some of that Confederate leadership was. And they are based around the man today whose legacy is becoming increasingly closely examined, Robert E. Lee, for whom the formerly named Lee High School was named. And there's been, of course, all the controversy in Richmond about the statue of Lee, etc. Robert E. Lee was a Confederate general. He was a leading U.S. military strategist. He was a notable figure from the Mexican War, so he had real military experience. He graduated, I think, second in his class from West Point, and Lincoln wanted him to lead the U.S. military during the war. But Lee hesitated. And because he was just like, oh, I don't know how this is going to play out. You know what I mean? I'm loyal to my country. But he ultimately felt a greater calling to Virginia as a Virginian. And he didn't feel once Virginia seceded after the attack on Fort Sumter, Lee then decides to join the side of the Confederacy and fight on behalf of the South. Lee didn't favor secession, but he didn't believe that a state like ours of Virginia could be held together by force. Now, Lee, of course, was a slave owner. He a wealthy slave owner and came from a prominent, affluent family of kind of this sort of legacy of military leadership. He had married into Martha Washington's family, for instance. So again, another notable slave-owning family. And his home where Lee lived was where Arlington Cemetery is today. Have you been to Arlington Cemetery? Arlington House that sits atop was Lee's family home. That was where he lived. And when the war was over and Lee loses, the United States seizes Lee's land and turns it into a cemetery for the U.S. military dead. Wow, huh? Instead. Robert E. Lee, known for his leadership, known for being a brilliant military mind, and one of the reasons why this war drags on for so long, and why the South is able to, continue fighting, was because they had really superior leadership through most of it. So let's take a look at these two images here about the greater resources. So why then does the North win? Take a look at these graphics, two separate ones. And if we were in Zoom right now, there'd be a poll question that would pop up, and it would say something to the effect of, all right, given these resources, which do you think were the top three advantages, like the three most important of all these advantages the North had? And it would give you things like total population, the bank deposits, the factories, firearms, food crops, and railroads. And asking you to say, okay, what do you think of those, like seven, were the three most important advantages that the union held? And then I would ask you to then defend those in the chat. So if we think about population, right, they have more people to lose, right? I know it's kind of grim telling here, but because the North had a greater population, they could afford to have more people die, be injured, and be in this war than the South could, right? If it is a war of attrition, they're going to come out with much greater advantages. Bank deposits as well going to be very important, because then what they don't have, they can invest and purchase from abroad. Factories, in order to produce things needed for the war effort, whether that might be those firearms or soldiers or soldiers' uniforms, or maybe even more important than anything, shoes. We'll get back to shoes here in a little bit. Shoes for soldiers to wear on their feet because they are marching a lot. And just plain food. What's the South have? If we look at this, cotton and a lot of donkeys and mules. Now, cotton, the South thought that advantage was going to trump everything, and in that it would kind of outrank and outdo all the many advantages that the Union had, because they thought that the Northern factories would shut down without the South's cotton. They thought that the European countries, Britain and France, were dependent upon Southern cotton, and they would come to the aid of the Confederacy in order to keep the cotton flowing to their factories. Now, the South made a big mistake here. Why? Well, for a couple reasons. European countries, especially Britain, had other access to cotton. If you remember, like, they didn't need the Confederacy's cotton anymore in the South, but as much, because if you remember your world history, in 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion happened, and after that, India it becomes part of the Raj, right? The Mughal Empire is going to kind of fade away, and there's going to be this more direct control over India with all of its amazing cotton. And if you also remember, the Suez Canal is going to be completed, and Egypt will be taken as kind of a protectorate status. If you remember, this is post like Muhammad Ali in Egypt as well. So you're going to see this, they're going to be having Egyptian cotton, which is amazing cotton. And they're not going to rely as much on and need that Southern cotton. And the other reason was there was a glut of cotton in 1859, like an overabundant production of cotton. And Northern factories had enough cotton to last them up through the middle of the 1860s without ever like losing pace. Because there was such a bumper production and crop of cotton, the North was good, and so were other places too. They didn't need that Southern cotton in order to kind of, keep it coming. Their major problem was just producing it all and keeping it moving so that it didn't rot. So we're looking at these advantages. You can make a good case as well for railroad tracks and why that was an important advantage in order to move these resources, and also people, not just things, but people. So that soldiers maybe didn't have to march. If they got railroads to take, how much more fast they can go and how much more like what less wear and tear, how much more easy that is to just go on a train versus marching from New York down to Maryland. All right, so looking at these many advantages was one reasons why, which begs the question, if the North had all these advantages, what took them so long? Why did this thing take 4 long, bloody years? And it really goes back to that one Southern advantage that they had the leadership. And as great as the Southern leadership was of the Confederacy, the North's military leadership was just that bad. It was just absolutely horrible. It was like, an A plus and then the lowest F kind of in leadership grades. It was just that mismatch is a key reason why this kind of drags on forever, seemingly, especially to the people fighting. So the Union strategy, one of the other reasons that they're effective is that the Union strategy was much more effective than what the Southern strategy was. The South was largely fighting a defensive war, though Lee recognized that in order to win, he needed to go on the offense, and he does that twice. But the Union strategy was something called the Anaconda Plan. And so we think about an anaconda as a constrictor snake, right? It's not a venomous snake, right? That has some sort of, venom and lethal kind of fangs that you need to worry about. No. It's one that's going to suffocate, right? And squeeze the life out of you. And then what does an anaconda do? Once you're just suffocated, its prey is suffocated and it's kind of limp. Then it's going to take the head, gobble it, and then take the surrounding parts and gobble up the rest of it. Well, that was the strategy that they used. That's why they called it the Anaconda Plan. So the first strategy is blockade, a naval blockade. If you look at the map here, you see all the little dots. They're going to suffocate the South so it can't get its cotton out and just squeeze it. And then control the Mississippi River. So again, continuing the constriction, not just going around the coastline to suffocate it, but then cutting off from the Mississippi River as well to separate the Confederacy by splitting Texas away from it with its foodstuffs that it was producing. So taking control and then going, of course, controlling up in here along the Ohio River Valley. And then after it was suffocated, go for the head, capture the capital. Right? Richmond. And then rounding up, gobble, the isolated military forces that are left. It's a brilliant strategy developed by Union General Winfield Scott. It just takes 4 years to implement because the Union people carrying this thing out were just that bad. Let me show you a little map here, another map. It's not here. Well, there's another map here that for some reason isn't here of the Anaconda Plan that shows these are depictions of with the snake around it in each of the states. And one thing that it mentions that it shows in that map very clearly is that one of the territories that was fighting as part of the Confederacy, right, that joined the South and fought with the Confederate States of America was Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And wondering why is it that those Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, that were all removed as a result of the Indian Removal Act under Jackson, why those people living in Indian Territory, aka Oklahoma today, why they would fight on behalf of the Confederacy? Like, why them? Well, if you think about it, right? The United States hadn't exactly done them right, hadn't treated them well at all. And if you also remember, many of the Cherokee upper class, right, were slave owners, and they wanted to continue this idea of slavery in that regard, right? And they would much rather have a local, more states-controlled government than have the U.S. federal government continue to exert influence over them, because so far that has not ever worked out well for the Native peoples, right? All right. So next up, taking a look at the Battle of Bull Run. This is considered the first armed confrontation of the Civil War, like the first actual fight battle of the war. And it happens here nearby, right at Manassas. Maybe you've been down there or dragged down there, as the case might be. It's in July of 1861, and it is his first battle. It is a Confederate victory. This is where Stonewall Jackson emerges as a hero because he stood firm like a stone wall and wouldn't back down, and his men then stayed and rallied behind him. Again, that initiative and daring leadership, especially early on in the war. This was fought very close here to Washington, D.C., obviously. Just a quick carriage ride away, so to speak. You get there in the afternoon, and it scared the Union badly. This loss really rattled them. Before this battle happened, like we had Fort Sumter and they were calling it out, right? And now it's July. Fort Sumter was back in April. Now it's July. Everybody was thinking this was going to be like a quick little war, that it was going to carry on for maybe, everybody would be home by Christmas and it would all be done with. But when the Union loses and loses badly in this battle, this is when the North goes, uh-oh, maybe we need to do something. Maybe we need to mobilize more fully. Maybe we need to kick those factories in gear. Oh gosh, we've got work to do. We need to kind of get on this. Whereas the South, on the other hand, didn't have that response. And if anything, they felt like validated. They're like, yeah, we got this, no problem. And it's kind of like for those of you that have been on, athletic teams, and you may have had like sometimes a loss can do more for a team than a win would have. Because then when people lose, as the North lost in this case, when people lose, they kind of get down to work and they kind of, practice harder, work harder, that kind of a thing. And that's what happened here with the Union. And the South just kind of sat back a little bit and didn't mobilize and have that sort of reaction. Now, it's important that we mention early on here why the North was fighting this war. If you go onto Canvas, I'm going to pause for a second and allow you to take a look at a letter. It's a PDF of a letter on there written by a man called Sullivan Ballou. He is a Union officer who is going to participate in the first Battle of Bull Run and tragically die at the first Battle of Bull Run. And he writes this letter that's posted for you on Canvas to look at. He writes this letter to his wife, Sarah, and it gets to her much later after she finds out he really has died. And in this letter, he writes about why he's fighting this war and kind of like his last words to his family, Sarah, his 2 kids, that kind of a thing. So I'm going to hope that you pause the video here and you go to Canvas and just take a moment to read that letter that's under this week's module. So you can pause the video. Alrighty, hopefully you've gone to Canvas now and you've ready to come back on. You've read that letter and you've taken away from that letter that Sullivan Ballou, nowhere in this letter does he mention that he is fighting a war to defend slavery. Like slavery isn't even mentioned or even a euphemism. Other such persons held in service of labor, abolition, the great evil, sin. No, not a thing, not even alluded whatsoever. Instead, why is it that Sullivan Ballou says he's willing to fight and potentially, which he does, give his life, right, to fight in this cause? What is that cause that he's willing to give up his wife, his children, little Edgar and unnamed child number 2, who doesn't get a name in the letter? What is it that he says he's fighting for? And he says he's fighting to repay that debt, right? He says, we've got a union that we built here. He says, it's my generation's turn to step up and fill that need. He says that this call of country binds me irresistibly, calls me to fight in this war. That whereas previous generations made this country, now it's my generation's obligation, their sense of duty to keep this country, to fight to preserve this. And that is really why people volunteered to fight in this war early on behalf of the Union. It wasn't, I mean, for some, it's going to be about ending slavery. But by and large, in the Union, the average soldier is fighting to defend this country, which isn't that different from why people volunteer to go join the armed forces today, right? But they don't talk about slavery because slavery is not the purpose or the cause of the war for which Lincoln says that he's fighting. And that's being echoed down, even though we know that slavery caused this war, right? That slavery was the cause of the war. The purpose that everyone's talking about is instead preserving the Union instead. So it's this interesting sort of dichotomy where we know that slavery caused the war, but the reason everyone says they're fighting is to preserve this country. They don't think that secession should be happening. So I hope you enjoyed reading Sullivan Ballew's letter to Sarah. It's a very sweet, sweet letter. Now, a key battle that happens is another one that's not too far away, and that is the Battle of Antietam. It's outside of Frederick, Maryland, around the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, and was the bloodiest single day of the war. Yikes, right? It was ultimately a Union victory, but again, the Union had more people they could afford to kind of expend and die in battle. Bloodiest single day of the war, and at this point, this is in September 1862. The war had been going really bad for Lincoln and the Union. It had just been loss after loss after loss. And finally, even though it was a devastating day, they get a win, the Union does, in which General McClellan defeats General Lee. Now, notice that Lee had made this offensive measure into Maryland because it's September, it's harvest season. Lee wants to feed his troops, and he doesn't want them to feed off of the crops that are being harvested in the South, like in Virginia. Instead, he's like, we're going to go into Union territory, into the border state of Maryland, and maybe because they are kind of sympathetic being slave owners and having slavery, maybe it'll go really well for us there. We'll get some kind of local support and everything within Maryland. And so he launches this offensive measure in the fall, very strategically timed around the agricultural calendar. But it is indeed a loss for Lee. And how the Union almost lost this thing is absolutely preposterous, because General McClellan even knew what Lee's battle plans were. This is how much he sucked. He knew what the number of troops, the regiment, everything that they had, the resources, what they were planning, who was planning to go where. He knew that in advance. And he still almost loses this thing, and it's the bloodiest single battle of the war. How did Lee get this? Well, in the town of Frederick, when McClellan's forces arrived to the town of Frederick, like soldiers and units are moving through all the time, and there's a courier that had a couple of days before had gone through for the Confederacy, had gone through Frederick and tied up his horse in a stall, and he had dropped this cigar. Well, what they thought was a cigar. It was a cigar that was then wrapped, and around it were all of his information, all of his battle plans. It was supposed to be like a deep, kind of in disguise so somebody wouldn't see what it was. Well, the courier dropped it, left it there. Next week come along Union forces, and this guy comes up. He thinks he's getting a cigar. He's like, sweet, I've got tobacco. This is awesome. And instead, he's like, wait a minute. This isn't what I thought it was. And he realizes what he has. He goes to the high command. He's like, I got something important to say. He turns this over, and McClellan goes, wow. And instead of saying, okay, let's get to work. Let's do what we got to do. Come on. We've got inside, intelligence now. This is amazing. He says, well, you know what? Well, we need to practice our marching. No joke. That's what he said. We need to practice marching and drilling right now instead. We need to make sure our soldiers are in tip-top shape and they can really march in a good line and that they're in good athletic, instead of actively trying to use the information to do something. It's amazing in some cases how this happened. Lincoln's furious with McClellan when he finds out about this. He's furious that Lee is allowed to retreat and McClellan doesn't go after him. After this victory, McClellan says, we need to regroup here and go back to more drilling and marching. And he just lets Lee get away instead of getting them wise down kind of an idea. God, he sucked. Bless his heart. But this victory leads to a key moment for Lincoln. Over the summer of 1862, and it's now September, Lincoln had drafted the document that becomes known as the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was just sitting in his desk drawer. But he was waiting for a Union victory in order to, release it, if you will, so that way it didn't look like it was like a last ditch kind of fledgling effort of a country that's been losing and losing and losing. And here they are trying to make it this sort of Hail Mary pass kind of a thing. No. He wants to do this and get a win. So after this win, he takes it out of his desk drawer and he says, Emancipation Proclamation. And what is this document? This is the one that you hear about that, quote, freed the slaves, but it doesn't. What it does is it freed slaves in rebelling states. That is a very limited step towards abolition. So to clarify, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the Confederacy only. That is, slaves over whom he had no control over. Enslaved people that, were under his authority right now. He wanted them to be, but, as part of the Union, but weren't. So it frees, so it's a very limited step, but it is a step, right? So there's that. And Lincoln does this as kind of in an attempt to undermine the Confederacy, but without alienating and angering the border states. Because if he would have just said all slaves are free, that would have included the border states' enslaved population. And what would have happened then? Would he have lost Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland? Would they have then, or Missouri, I think I missed in there, would they have seceded and joined the Confederacy? That wouldn't have been good. So he doesn't want to anger them. So he makes this very limited step towards abolition here, very limited, freeing slaves over whom he had no authority. But it does this. It changes the purpose of the war now to being no longer just being about preserving the Union, but making the destruction of slavery a Northern war aim, thereby strengthening the moral cause. Like we're fighting for something, bigger, right, of the Union. He doesn't want to alienate the border states. That's why this is so limited. And it's also going to discourage any interference from foreign governments, especially the British, because the British people, most notably, and also the French as well, were very much anti-slavery at this point. They saw slavery as interfering with the free market. They saw slavery as not only a corrupt system, an immoral system, but also as something that undermined their work to work as free labor in factories. That enslaved people were giving, or that enslaved labor was giving like an unfair advantage to southern states. So by making the war now being about ending slavery, the British were going to be less likely to come to the aid of the South and help them. If you remember our study of the American Revolution, how important it was that the American colonies received the assistance of the French. And that was really a big reason why the American colonies were able to win in the American Revolution. Now, if the same sort of thing would have happened here, if the British were to come to the aid of the southern states, that would have supplied them with a navy, resources, money, all sorts of things that they didn't have. And that may have really changed the war. So it was really important here that European countries stay out of this from the Union's perspective. And finally, this document also did something very important. It allowed for the formal enlistment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. Now, Black men had always served in U.S. conflicts, always. But this is going to make it a formal process, and we're going to see people like these soldiers here as part of the military effort. Now, let's talk about some of the key turning points of this war that happens a year later in 1863, kind of fulfilling that Anaconda Plan goal of strangling the South by cutting off access to the Mississippi River and controlling that river so that things couldn't get in or out of the South, is the Union victory that happens of the Confederate fort of Vicksburg that's along the Mississippi River. This happens in 1863, and it's a siege, which means that Union forces surrounded it and isolated it until they surrendered. They isolated, attacked it, bombed it, did all these things until finally the Confederacy waved the white flag and said, like, we give up, it's no good. And that's this Union victory at Vicksburg will then open up the Mississippi River for the Union now and give them complete control of the Gulf of Mexico, fulfilling that Anaconda Plan squeeze strategy. The Union general that was in charge of Vicksburg was Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant's victory here inspires Lincoln. He's like, I finally have found somebody that knows how to fight, that knows how to do this war thing. And he then is going to place Grant in command of the whole Union Army. And that will be a big turning point militarily for the Union military. Now, at the same time as on 4th of July, what an ominous day for that to be happening, this big Union victory, because the siege had started like in May, I think, and it had gone on and on and on, and finally ends on July 4th. At the same time as that's happening in 1863, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a 3-day, not months, but 3-day battle was concluding also on July 4th, 1863. And it too was a Union victory and seen very much as a turning point in the war. Lee had once again launched an offensive all the way up into Pennsylvania. And you know how I told you there were shoes involved? Shoes are involved. Lee wants to make a big offensive measure. He wants to kind of rally his people and also get his soldiers off of Southern land and kind of tearing up Southern resources, like unintentionally, and using up those Southern resources. He wants to get them into them and kind of demoralize the North as well. The Confederates are marching in Pennsylvania, Quaker land, and wants to kind of get support and again go through Maryland and hopefully get support from Marylanders as well as they march north. But in the town of Gettysburg, there was a seminary there, like a religious institution to train people. There was a, small little town, kind of an idea. Today there's a college, right? But there was also a factory that made shoes. And many of his soldiers were without shoes. Like they were barefoot, or their shoes were so worn out that they didn't have soles to them. They were picking up things and making these sort of makeshift shoes and sandals because the Confederacy lacked the resources, whereas Union soldiers were going to be issued uniforms and shoes and blankets and all this gear to the point that it was so much crap that they had, just pounds and pounds. The Confederate soldier is just kind of left on his own, doesn't have those resources because why? States' rights. It's all about the locality trying to do things. Oh, each state, it's a decentralized Confederate system. There isn't any sort of like taxing or central government to coordinate and mandate that. So the poor Confederate soldiers are very much incentivized to go and attack Gettysburg. So he says, and if we take Gettysburg, there's a shoe factory there. And people are like, oh, yes, let's go. I need shoes because I've just marched from the South all the way to Pennsylvania. Now, after this battle happens, obviously many, many people die. And a few months later, in November of 1863, so the battle's in July, and then in November of 1863, Lincoln goes to the site of Gettysburg to give what became famed as the Gettysburg Address. It's very short. The whole thing is pretty much what you see there on that little document. It was up and down in less than a minute. He gave his saying, shorter than your eulogy that you'll give. And in this speech, he is going to do the things you see here. Describe the Civil War as a struggle to preserve the nation and declare, just say it, all men are created equal. He's going to argue that we're a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, and say that America is one nation, not a collection of separate little states. And he says secession is a false claim. Can't do it. You entered, you cannot just leave. And this kind of statement that the Gettysburg Address becomes, this kind of epitomizing American ideals, how we want to see ourselves as a nation now, trying to walk the walk of the Declaration of Independence when Thomas Jefferson said that all men are created equal, but not. And here he is saying, no, we are dedicated to that proposition, and we're going to try now to increasingly try to make that a true statement. And it's always been this sort of work in progress, this sort of goal that the United States is always working for, going back to 1776. And Lincoln is going to emphasize that again. And with this idea, especially now that we're looking at, ending slavery when this war is over. Now, one of the reasons mentioned that initial thesis statement too was that there was considerable home front opposition. So in the Union, let's take a look at the column on the left. In the Union, the home front opposition consisted mostly of people living in the border states, which makes sense. Those were states that were slave owning but did not secede. That's where you're most likely to find opposition to the Union within the Union. And people that were opposed to the Union and were kind of like working against Lincoln all along were nicknamed Copperheads. A lot of snake analogies today. And that's what this picture is kind of showing right here. And I want you to think about a copperhead snake, because we do see those, in this area, unfortunately, very scary. And that a copperhead is noted because it can very easily disguise itself, can't it? It can camouflage itself under leaves and so on. And it is venomous. It can, just come at you and seemingly kind of unprovoked as well, right? If you kind of, if it feels threatened, it will most definitely attack. And that is why these people that opposed the Union, that were living within the Union and were kind of committing these acts of sometimes sabotage, sharing intelligence, being spies, and sometimes, and running against Lincoln, like McClellan becomes a Copperhead, that general, once he's fired for being a crappy leader, are known as Copperheads. Now, in the Confederacy, we see a lot of the home front opposition, people living within the South that are undermining the Confederate war effort. One way they do that is by tax and draft evasion. Because it was a confederacy, like the Articles of Confederation, they didn't have any sort of strong central authority, and people just said, I'm not going to pay those taxes. No, I'm not going to do that. Oh, you want to draft me? You can't make me. States' rights. You can't do that. You can't make, that kind of an idea. So we don't have, so one of the ways that there was opposition is that people didn't pay the taxes. They didn't follow their draft orders as well. Most people who were opposing the Southern war effort that were within the South lived in Appalachia. So in the along the Appalachian foothills and in the mountains themselves, and I want you to think about why that might be. Why people that oppose the Confederacy tend to live in Appalachia, and hopefully you'd come to the conclusion that that's because they weren't slave owners and they didn't rely on slavery, and they had always resented the wealthy elite that lived in more coastal areas. Going back to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, resented the dominance of the southern coastal slave-owning wealthy landed elite. And we still seem to see some of that resentment between coastal South and the Appalachian, the poor area, right? Other opposition came in the form of enslaved people who ran away. That's great opposition, undermining by literally taking their workers from them, and sabotage, destroying cotton gins, burning fields as well. And because supplies like foodstuffs were in such short supplies, women rioted in Richmond and held a full-on bread riot that went on for a couple of days. It was right out of the French Revolution. So women that were hungry were like, I can't feed my children. You aren't taking care of it. This is in Richmond, where the Confederacy capital is, launching bread riots as well. So opposition there that's happening because of food shortages. So, and then lastly, the other final reason why the North is able to win, kind of contributes into their victory here, is the wartime destruction of the South's environment and infrastructure. And that's mostly due to the actions by General William Tecumseh Sherman. What does Sherman do? Sherman takes control of Atlanta and burns it. Yep, burns it. Capture and burning of Atlanta. Have you ever seen Gone with the Wind? It's kind of this old movie full of racist tropes. But pictures the burning of Atlanta. And then Sherman, he's like, when he marches his campaign, he goes march to the sea, where he goes from Atlanta. Get my cursor here, and he has his soldiers, he has them intentionally, the troops spread out wide so that they could then march to Savannah, and he gives them the order of make Georgia howl, destroy everything in your path, make them pay. He's the one that coins, though I'm sure he's not the first to ever think it, war is hell. And he says, and they need to see, we need to break their will. This is a campaign of total war, right? Where you're not just attacking combatants, but also non-combatants. So they pillaged, they burned houses. They, as you can see in this picture, they destroyed railroads. They were known for taking up the railroad ties, the process, and melting them, and then bending them around trees, even just to kind of they call them Sherman's bow ties, just to like sort of psychological warfare to make the South feel like, oh crap, what were we thinking? This is not good. We don't have a prayer. And he goes to Savannah and then marches up through the center, doing the same thing through South Carolina and then onward, essentially following what is today like I-95. And then onward going that way. Just absolutely the sort of total war campaign that was new. We don't think about total war typically till we talk about like World War One, but the Civil War in many ways shows the precursors to things that are much more 20th century. And Sherman was an early pioneer, if you will, of total war strategy. His name became vilified in the South, is still not one that you want to say too loudly in certain areas of Georgia, that's for sure. But the destruction, right? Salting the earth, it was something, straight out of Carthage. Finally, how does this war end? It ends at Appomattox Courthouse, back here in Virginia. Appomattox Courthouse is the very long and awkwardly named title or name of that town. It is just south of Richmond and Petersburg. Usually see the signs for it when you're traveling down 95 South. And this is on April 9th, 1865, and it's the site where Lee surrenders to General Grant. They meet in this house. And Lee then is going to urge Southerners to accept defeat and unite as Americans. When some wanted to continue fighting, launch guerrilla warfare, and so on, Lee's like, enough people died. Let's move on here. So that is the end of our notes today. I was going to see if I can make this big here. No, I'm afraid if I click it, it's going to go crazy. So that's the end of our notes today. I hope that this has provided you with good content. If it's been, not quite an hour here of lecture material, which we would have done in class today. Remember, you need to be looking at your paper 4 topic, though it isn't due to a well after break. Follow your calendar, and you're welcome to email me with any questions or concerns that you might have. Take care, everybody. Have a great break, or maybe you're having a good break, depending on when you're watching this. And I'm sorry the class turned out the way it did today. So take care, everybody, and Happy New Year to everyone as well.